It's February and I'm planting dahlias today. So I thought I'd walk you along and show you the process on how I do it for best results. Now, normally I wouldn't be planting in February, but if you notice, I'm in my high tunnel. In my climate, which is actually pretty mild, it's about 55 degrees right now, middle of February, you can plant dahlias in a tunnel about 6 weeks before your last frost if you want earlier blooms. I thought, why not? So that's what I'm doing. There's a couple reasons why I'm doing that, but the number one is I want to just see how early they bloom if I do it. But number two is this is a dahlia seedling that I'm working on hybridizing, and I want to cross it with another dahlia that I think has better form to see what I get from those seeds. So I actually want it isolated. I let the bees do a lot of pollination. This way I know that those are probably the only two dahlias that are crossing. So that's what I'm doing. I'm planting in a tunnel and we'll see how it goes. But everything else in this video applies to when you plant out in your field. The only difference is going to be when exactly you do it, and I'll talk about that. Dahlias are a warm weather flower. They do not like frost, and they will die if temperatures drop below 32 degrees Fahrenheit. So you don't want to plant them in winter unless you have a tunnel or a greenhouse or something that's going to keep it above those temperatures. So what you're looking for is your last frost is done and your soil temperature is around 60 degrees. Now, can you plant before your soil temperature gets there? Yes, but your dahlias are going to grow the best if you just wait that extra bit of time until your soil warms up, and there's going to be less chance that you'll lose your tubers to rot. Now, if you can see this ugly potato, this is called a tuber, and this is what dahlias normally how they're grown. You can grow them from seed, but if you grow them from seed, dahlias are so genetically diverse, you have no idea what you're gonna get. They're not gonna look the same as the dahlia that you took them from. The only way to know for sure what kind of dahlia you're gonna grow is by growing from a tuber. Now, every season, you're gonna plant a tuber that looks like this, and then over May, June, July, August, September, October, it's gonna grow a tuber clump that looks something like this or like this. And this tuber clump will have more tubers that you can then cut off, and you can grow identical plants next year. So from one tuber in a season, you could easily get anywhere between 5, I've gotten up to 20 before, it kind of depends on the variety, tubers that you can then grow and propagate and get more of the same flower the next year. Now, you can't just grow any tuber. I can't just cut off anything on this clump and have it grow. It needs some very specific things. So it needs any type of body like this, but also size actually doesn't really matter. So these two tubers would grow the exact same plant, the exact same flower. There wouldn't be any difference in like the vigor of the plant. It just needs a body to help feed off of while it's growing. And then this is called the neck, and you need this to be unbroken, because what it does is the neck takes the nutrients from the body and cycles it up to where there is an eye, and this is what is going to sprout and grow your plant. So you can see this is a dormant eye. It's just starting to wake up, but this is where like all your green shoots are going to come from. So they can look all different ways. Like this is actually has an eye, and it has like kind of a weird neck, and it has a body. So this is going to grow just fine. Some of them have very long skinny necks, and there's an eye right there. So that one's going to grow. Some of them are a lot smaller. These are actually all the same variety, and they're still going to grow the same plant. But as long as it has that body and the neck needs to be unbroken and it goes up to the eye, you're going to get a plant and you're going to get a beautiful dahlia. Now, I've seen a lot of discussion on which way you want to plant your tubers, and let's just talk about, can you just plant a clump like this? Could you just, you know, replant a clump? Yes, you absolutely can. It is recommended, and I strongly recommend that if you decide to plant a tuber clump like this, that you dig it up every couple years and at least chop it into half and then plant those two halves. Because what can happen is if you leave these in the ground for years on end, is that even a clump like this, every one of these tubers is going to start to grow another clump, which means that over time you're going to get like this massive root ball of tubers, and if it gets too crowded, they're not going to grow and bloom very well. So if you're not interested in like separating them out for like the maximum amount of plants, dig up your clumps and literally just chop it into halves or thirds and then replant those clumps, and that way you'll get a few more plants every year, but you won't end up with a situation where you have a plant that isn't blooming. I see a lot of discussion on how to plant a tuber, like which way, do you do it this way or you do it this way? And the thing is it really doesn't matter. Like, it does not matter. The only time it might matter a little bit is if you have heavy clay soil. So I know a lot of hybridizers who plant them vertically, and they do this because when they dig the clumps up, the way the stalk grows is all the tubers are actually a lot easier to divide because they kind of all grow down vertically. I will say that if you plant them vertically, you have to be a little bit more careful when you dig them up, because if they're all going down, it's a little bit easier to break the necks, but it's also totally possible. If you have heavy clay soil, I don't recommend planting vertically because it's a little bit more likely, in my experience, that this part up here is going to rot before the tuber can sprout, in which case it's not going to sprout at all because the clay holds in more moisture. So it doesn't matter really, but most people plant them horizontally instead of vertically. But if you plant them vertically, I do it both ways. They grow the same. Doesn't matter. I also see a lot of people talking about how you need bone meal and you need all this other stuff when you plant them, and you don't. I might step on a few people's toes, but I never use any of that, and my fields look great. What I do, the only thing that I do is I will spread and like rake through dried molasses before I plant, and I'll talk about that a little bit later on, but I do this as a form of insect prevention, which is an interesting technique that has worked really well for me. But in order to plant, all you're gonna do is make sure your soil is tilled or loose somewhat. You're gonna dig a hole, and vertically, horizontally, doesn't matter. You're looking for about 4 inches down, 4 to 6 inches, and you're just gonna cover it. And at that point, you just wait. You don't need to water. You don't really need to do anything. You just wait until it sprouts, which generally happens within a couple weeks, depending upon the warmth of your soil. Standard recommendation is don't water until they sprout because of the risk of the tuber rotting before it can grow. And the only thing I would add to that is that if you live in a really hot climate and your soil is dry, you do need to water somewhat. You don't want to overwater, but you are basically looking for like this is not dry soil. This is like very lightly damp. They are plants. They need moisture in order to sprout. If you stick them in bone dry soil, they're not going to do anything. And then the last main note that I would have is on spacing tubers. I have done it multiple ways, and here's my caveats for each ways. If you are planning on cutting from your dahlias like every week and you are growing them for cut flowers and you don't really intend to leave a lot on the plant, you can actually space them 9 inches apart. I did that for years because I was growing mostly for market bouquets, and it worked great. I stripped the lower leaves to help airflow. So like the lower 12 inches of the plant, once it was full grown, I stripped those leaves down, and I'll do a video showing how to do that in summer. But I kept those flowers cut. They did fine. So if you're short on space and you want more flowers, I've done 9 inches. It works. Standard recommendation would be 12. And that's what I do now, but I leave a lot more flowers on the plant because I'm actually moving more into saving seed for hybridization. So 12 inches apart. If you really want them to have like maximum space, you can do 18 inches, but honestly, I think that's overkill and really not necessary at all. My preferred method of planting is to lay out a row of tubers so I can see what kind of spacing I'm doing, and then go back and plant them all. All right, while I plant these, let's talk about the molasses real quick. So molasses, a long time ago, I listened to this podcast by Jenny Love, who does no-till flowers, and she interviewed a guy whose career was studying insects, and they talked about how insects have basically the way they digest food is they're attracted to plants that have a certain sugar content, and if your sugar content is too low, they will want those plants. So there's basically a sugar content level, which leaf biting insects, which typically are not the ones that we want, they can't digest that. So the theory is that if your sugar content in your plants gets up to a certain height, they're gonna bite a leaf and they're not gonna be able to digest that leaf, and so they're just gonna move on. So I started to experiment with spraying my plants with a mixture of molasses and water to artificially raise the Brix level of the plants and to see what happens. And I admit that I was a little skeptical, but it worked. And it's extremely interesting to me because I did this, and I got a refractometer and I measured the sugar content in my plants, and generally the number that you're looking for is you want it higher than 12. So mine, I think when I started was around 8, so it was actually pretty high already. But it was really interesting to me because I would see things like cucumber beetles, which will chomp away at dahlias like full scale, and they were just sitting on my plants and they would not touch them. So this meant that I didn't have to use organza bags. This meant that I didn't have to use chemicals, which I didn't use anyway because I'm an organic farmer, and if I don't need to use a chemical, I'm not going to. And my definition of need is a lot more narrow than most people's definitions. So I kept doing this. So this is why I add the dried molasses to the soil, and if you were gonna add anything to the hole where you put the tuber, I'd put a little pile of dried molasses because that will feed the plant as well and help raise the sugar content. And it's a little bit easier than spraying your plants every couple weeks with molasses. But Brix levels will raise naturally if you follow more organic practices. Spraying chemicals messes a lot with the way the plants naturally act. So you can do it naturally. Just using molasses will help artificially raise it. And the cool thing about it is that it's perfectly safe. It does not even kill the bad insects. Like it doesn't touch them. It doesn't kill pollinators. It doesn't bother them. The only thing that it does is for insects that bite leaves, it just makes them not want to do it. So I've been doing this for several years. I've had great results with it. I could talk for like a 3-hour video on this topic. I have not even scratched the surface. So instead of doing that, I'm just gonna post the link to the podcast I originally listened to. Yeah, my hands are dirty. And I highly recommend you listen to it, especially if you're just interested in not using pesticides. So many people who started doing it after I posted about it a while ago have written back and be like, yeah, it totally works. So that's what I recommend, and that's why I put molasses in my soil.